Yeah, thank you guys, everyone who is still here on Saturday afternoon, and the organizers of the conference and SPY for paying for the study. I think as one plug, I think those letters they were stuffing are for a study Anya and I are doing on donation that Terry Zhu talked about yesterday.
The intern is funding this study.
What?
We're doing the study on donations, which the donations are coming in and funding.
Right, and those letters, right, are funding this study, exactly. So it's, and Anya, of course, is what ties it all together. So the title's a bit different than what's in the program. It's actually the learning effects of social pressure and commitment, but I will talk about welfare effects a little bit, but the more interesting results, I think, are around learning. This is a bit different than, I guess that's why I'm in special topics, a bit different than the other talks we've seen, but I do think it relates importantly to philanthropy in that there's a growing interest in using behavioral, what I'm going to call nudges, to help achieve philanthropic and policy goals. So getting kids to try harder in school, getting people to save more, getting people to make healthier choices. And the whole idea behind these nudges is that you sort of use insights from behavioral economics to kind of trick people into making choices that they wouldn't otherwise. And the idea is that, the sort of libertarian paternalism idea is that you're getting them to make choices that are better for them, and hopefully, once people make that choice, they will learn that, oh, actually, you know what, this is the choice I actually do prefer, and that will lead to long-term behavioral change. But I think this is where behavioral economics is kind of having a challenge. It's actually been really hard to show that these nudges do have a long-term impact. Usually things fade out, and it's hard to get sort of any behavior change after you remove the nudge. So unless you're constantly nudging someone, you don't really get these long-term effects. And then another question that comes out of this is, if you are getting people to do something that they wouldn't choose otherwise, does this come at a welfare cost? Are you sort of pushing people into less preferable choices that are utility decreasing? And as far as I know, at least in this context, it hasn't been a lot of measurement of this, but this is all very new, and so I'm really hoping that you guys can come tell me about some paper that we're totally ignoring and we need to take a look at. So these two key questions lead to the design questions about whether nudges should be weak or strong, and whether they should be voluntary or externally imposed. So the idea has been that there's a trade-off. The stronger the nudge, the more you can push people into making these choices, but that might come at a greater welfare cost. And in particular, if these are voluntary, then people might be less likely to sign up for these kinds of things. So what I really have in mind are commitment devices that have been tested, things that, they're sort of weak commitment devices like labeling something. You should set this money aside and use it for education. Or a strong commitment device, which is you should put this money into a bank account which can only be used for education. And the idea is that stronger nudge might tie people's hands too much and not give them enough flexibility, might decrease their welfare, and also might lead to people being less likely to sign up for them. But what all these commitment devices rely on is that people are sophisticated about the fact that they have some sort of self-control problem, and therefore they voluntarily take up a commitment device. But we think there's probably a whole host of people that are naive about their self-control problems, and they won't take up commitment devices unless they're externally imposed on them. So the idea is, if we externally impose a nudge on someone, do they then learn, oh, I do have this self-control problem, and then that leads to learning, which leads to long-term behavior change. So that's the idea that we're testing here. A second goal of this is more related to our context of food choice. And a key philanthropic goal is improving nutrition and eating habits of young children. And there's an important, so this has an important challenge, which is that parents are usually making most of the food choices for their children, but of course then children choose whether or not to eat the foods the parents have chosen for them. And one thing we're really interested in is how can food subsidies be used most effectively? So for instance, the WIC program actually restricts which foods people can use their WIC subsidy for, versus food stamps like SNAP often provide incentives, for instance, doubling up your bucks if you use them at a farmer's market. And again, this is sort of these weak versus strong nudges, and how can we get people to put some of their own resources into this goal of improving nutrition and eating habits among young children. Okay, so what do? We measure the impact of what I'm calling a weak and a strong nudge on food choice, welfare, and most importantly, longer-term behavior. The program was conducted in Chicago Heights, which I'm sure by now you guys have heard a lot about Chicago Heights. It's about 30 miles south of here, and we run a lot of programs down there. We offer parents weekly delivery of kids' snack baskets for 4 weeks. And what they do is parents choose 10 $1 items from a selection of snack foods. So I think it's important from a policy perspective that parents actually like what's in this basket. I think a lot of these programs have run up against problems because they give parents, kale and bok choy, and then parents, have no idea what to do with this, or they don't like it. And so we purposely chose foods that are very easy to prepare. The most you'd have to do is peel something or cut it. And it was meant as a snack for the child. And that was sort of how we messaged everything, that you're supposed to be choosing things that your kids would want to snack on. And then we elicit the parents' willingness to pay for the basket out of their participation fee. So they received a participation fee for coming in. They actually did another study prior to this one. So we give them enough money to pay for 4 weeks of this basket. And then we say, okay, we're gonna randomly pick a coupon that gives you a discount on this basket. If the coupon gives you the basket for free, do you want it? If it gives it to you for $1 a week, so $4 total, do you want it? And so on. And if you say that you want it, then you're gonna have to actually take that money from your participation fee and pay for it. So this is their money at this point, and they will have to put their own real money towards paying for these baskets. We then randomly choose a price, and parents purchase the basket if they are willing to pay the randomly chosen price. And the way we overweighted low prices, so about 60% of people end up purchasing the basket. So this is what they're choosing from. And what you can see is that there's a mix of fruits and vegetables, what we're going to call healthy foods, and then sort of typical bad for you snack foods, Cheetos, Cheez-Its, Doritos, and that's what we're going to call the unhealthy foods. And in the control group, all these foods are mixed together. They're just listed in alphabetical order. And as I said, you pick 10 items from here, and if you wanted to, you could pick 10 apples. But basically, these are all valued at $1, and you pick 10 things you want in your basket. So that's what happens in the control group. In the nudge group, before you choose your basket, we give you a video that Anya starred in, telling you about how important it is to eat healthy foods and why it's important for your child to have healthy foods, and giving you tips about how to prepare these foods for your children and get them to eat them and so on. And what we see this as is really social pressure or experimenter demand. I mean, that's usually a bad thing in experiments. People don't want that, but we purposely know that that's what's going on here. I mean, these parents know Anya. They're being called in by these people that are giving them money. They're being told, you really should be putting healthy foods in your basket. So we're purposely actually trying to take advantage of that here, that we're giving them this message, and they'll probably feel pressure from us to put healthy foods in there, even if they don't want to. And that's this idea, right? We think we're nudging them to put healthy foods in, but they might not actually want to fill their basket that way. And the other thing we do is we separately list the healthy foods and the unhealthy foods, so it makes it easier for them to choose the healthy foods. Then in the final treatment, which I sort of think of as the commitment treatment, called the restricted treatment, you get all the same information as in nudge, but you only choose from healthy foods. You only get the sheet with the fresh fruits and vegetables. So this is one form of commitment, right? That you restrict your choices to only those things that are sort of in your long-term self-interest. But this is very restrictive, right? Because they can only choose the healthy foods, even if they don't want to. Okay. Then about 4 to 5 weeks after the initial session, so some people have been receiving baskets once a week, and some people who weren't willing to pay haven't been. They all come back, and then we get about 80% of people back. Now, all the treatment groups experience what the control group experienced in the initial session. So they don't see a video, they don't get any sort of extra pressure from us, right? They're just coming in, and we say, okay, now again, you're gonna choose your basket. All the foods, the healthy and the unhealthy foods are mixed together. Again, we're gonna elicit your willingness to pay, and then you'll, again, buy the basket if we choose a price that you're willing to pay. But before they do this, we ask them, do you want to only have healthy foods in your basket? And if they say yes, then we only give them sheets with healthy foods on them. So this is voluntary commitment. They are voluntarily choosing to restrict their basket. And this is what most commitment devices look like. Most of them are voluntary, whereas before we actually put some people into externally imposed commitment. Okay, so first we're going to look at the food choices in the initial basket. So in control, we actually have a fairly high percentage of people. They put about 75% healthy foods in their basket. And of course, in the restricted basket, 100% of the foods are healthy because we forced people to do that. So the question is, where is nudge, this sort of Anya telling you this is what you should do, where does that lie between these two bars? And what we find is that nudge significantly increases the healthy choices made by parents. It's still significantly lower than the restricted basket, but it's very close. It's about, I think, 93% of the foods on average are healthy in those baskets. Then the question is, well, does this come at any sort of welfare cost? Meaning, okay, I put these foods in my basket because you told me to, but I don't like my basket anymore. And so this is where the willingness to pay comes in. We see, well, how much do you actually like this basket? How much are you willing to pay for this basket that we kind of pressured you into making? And what we find is that there's no evidence that people like their restricted basket less. Directionally, we see that they might actually like their nudge basket a little bit less. There's, it's hard on willingness to pay because there's high variance, and so it's hard to get significance. So I don't want to say that this means, oh, everybody likes their basket equally. We can't really say that much, but I think we can fairly confidently say that the restricted basket, the stronger nudge, actually, if anything, is people prefer that to the weaker nudge. Altogether, what this means is if you take sort of the percentage of foods in the basket that are healthy and multiply it by the person's willingness to pay, you get the person's willingness to pay for healthy foods. And what we find is that in the restricted basket, we significantly increase people's willingness to pay for healthy foods, but not in the nudge treatment because we push the percentage of healthy foods up less, and the willingness to pay goes down a little bit. So now what we're really interested in is learning. So when people come back, are they more likely to take up this commitment device voluntarily? Now, you could actually think it might go the other way. They might think, I was forced to put healthy foods in my basket last month. Now I just want to go wild. Or they could say, you know what, I enjoy putting more healthy foods in my basket, and I want to actually restrict myself to that now. So what we find is in the control group, so the people that got no messaging in the initial session, about 20% of people take up this commitment device voluntarily. And that's very reassuring to me because that's about the kinds of rates you see for voluntary take-up in most studies of these kinds of commitment devices. And then in the nudge and restricted treatments, we see that those rates almost double, or more than double actually, in the restricted treatment. And this is very significant. And even when you take into account attrition, we actually have slightly higher rates of attrition in our treatment groups. These effects are still significant. So I actually have to say, I was really surprised that these results were so strong for what I thought was a pretty lightweight intervention. I mean, 5 weeks earlier, they spent a half an hour picking out this basket. And basically from that, they were more likely to want to restrict their basket a month later. And as a result, partly because they're more likely to take up this commitment device, the foods in the basket are also healthier. But we have positive but not significant treatment effects on the willingness to pay for the basket itself and the willingness to pay for healthy foods. So there's some suggestive evidence that those nudge people that dislike their basket a little bit, they didn't like their basket quite as much in the initial session. Now they like it more. There's some suggestive evidence that it's actually easier to choose healthy foods when you restrict yourself to healthy foods. It's consistent with this idea of self-control costs, that if I feel like I should be picking healthy foods, I don't want to have to resist all those pictures of Cheetos and Doritos. So I'm actually better off having that restricted basket. The effects are stronger for those who are randomly more likely to receive the basket. So people who randomly picked very low price coupons, and so they were randomly more likely to receive the basket. The effects are stronger for them, but we also see effects among people who didn't receive the basket, which I think was pretty interesting. We don't see treatment effects on kids' familiarity or with taste for healthy foods, which didn't surprise me. I think it's hard to move that. This is a pretty lightweight intervention. Not even everyone got the basket, but it does raise this concern that there could be kinds of substitution going on where, okay, yes, when I'm in front of you, I put healthy foods in my basket, but I go home and I don't even eat the food, or I give my kids something else. But, to the extent that we have both the comparison to the control group, we can kind of use those differences to think about to what extent substitution might be going on. So, to conclude, we find that externally imposed nudges increase take-up of a commitment device. There's suggestive evidence that stronger nudges are more robust, so the restricted treatment tends to have larger effects, but usually not significantly different from the nudge treatment. There's no evidence that the more restrictive nudges impose larger welfare costs, and this does imply that some people are naive about the benefits of commitment devices and can learn through nudges, and is consistent with a model of costly self-control that I talked about, that people might prefer to actually have these smaller choice sets. I think we have less to say about child nutrition, but I think we do are starting to inform the design of these interventions. We do demonstrate that people are willing to pay for this fruit and vegetable delivery, but not full price, and that nudges work primarily through shifting food choice rather than willingness to pay, and it's difficult for a small intervention to move measures of children's eating. So here's where we'd really like to get feedback, because like a lot of projects here, this is sort of hot off the press, and we think that this is the first study to examine the causal effects on commitment take-up. So as I said, normally, you observe who takes up commitment, and then maybe you correlate it with some preferences, but I haven't seen a study that does an intervention and then looks at the effect of that intervention on commitment take-up. And I also haven't seen much on trying to examine whether there's some welfare costs to these nudges. But like I said, there might be something I'm missing, and so we would really like to hear from you guys about that or other comments about the study.
So we have at least 5 minutes for questions.
Great.
So it's yours.
So did you ask them why they chose to commit or why they made these choices? I'm wondering if they were looking for reciprocity from the experimenters in terms of, I'm going to show you I'm behaving well, and if I do what you told me I should be doing, then maybe we'll get something from you.
Yeah, so that experimenter demand that I talked about could still be there 5 weeks later, and I'm not sure how we ever rule that out.
Well, you can ask them. You can just ask them why.
Did you do it because you wanted
Not that, no, but just more open-ended.
More open-ended.
Why did you choose to commit, or why did you choose this type of message?
Yeah.
That would
I mean, we didn't do that, but I mean, there are Czech parents, so we could probably go back, see if they still remember. It was a while ago.
That's useful because the effects are strong.
I mean, I find them a bit shocking.
I think they're really nice. And
Yeah.
It's a question of really nailing down
Yeah.
why that's happening.
And I do think,
some of these alternatives.
yeah, I do think that's a problem for us, right? That experimenter demand could still be in there. Like I said, I did think it could go
This is
the
different
other
than
way.
experimenter demand. It's related to, it's just reciprocity. It's the same sort of thing you get in these cultural experiments. You go out to these bush economies in some parts of the world, and they used to the idea that if I treat the experimenter well, I'm going to get more hits in the future.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that sort of thing could be happening here also.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I could say is that, to some extent, right, the control people also want to treat us well. They have that same reciprocity going on. Maybe we haven't given them that same message about healthy foods. The nudge people, they haven't experienced this restriction. All they know from us is that we want them to choose healthy foods, but they could do that from the mixed list. They don't actually have to restrict their basket. So to some extent, it makes me feel a little better, but I agree with you. I mean, I think that problem does underlie the results.
So my question was, you mentioned briefly that you have some differential attrition. I wonder if you think that that's a problem, how big of a deal it is, what you can do about it.
Yeah, so I definitely am concerned, because what you might think is that the people who didn't like our nudges don't want to come back and be subjected to that again, right? So I am concerned about that. I mean, we did these Lee lower bounds, which basically says, if everybody who didn't come back looks like the people in control, to make it simple. But if people have a better way to correct for attrition that they're more convinced by, please let me know. But I was very happy to see that those Lee lower bounds were still significant, so that made me feel a little bit better. But I think it is a concern. Yeah.
So to what degree do you think can we disentangle these social pressure effects, and that people might incur a social cost from choosing like the unhealthy foods, or they expect you, they think you expect them to choose the healthy foods, and at what extent do you think are you actually shifting people's beliefs by supplying information because they underestimate like the beneficial effects?
Yeah, so I mean, I think our attempt to do that is to look at the willingness to pay for the basket. So the idea would be, I really don't want to do this, but I'm doing it just because I'm being forced to, basically, by the experimenter. Our idea was that they might undo that a little bit in their willingness to pay. Okay, I did what you told me, but I don't actually want to put my own money into this basket because I don't want this thing. And so, I mean, you see the evidence we have for and against that. You know, I think we have suggestive evidence, but the effects aren't strong. But if you have other ideas on how we might disentangle those things, but that was our approach, why we had that willingness to pay in there. Is there another question?
Do we have time for one more question, and then we'll have questions after the next talk?
So Sally, when you were dividing up, was the classroom divided up into some are controlled, some are this treatment, some are the other treatment? I mean, the kids themselves in the classroom.
It wasn't. So this was all done on the parents. So
I know, but those kids that go to school, I mean, are they then in the same class and some kids are in the
well, these are actually our control parents. So their children do not attend our preschool. They might happen to be in the same child care environment. They all have sort of alternative child care arrangements other than going to our preschool. I think we have in our data what they do for child care, so we could maybe look at that.
Because what I was thinking is, I mean, really what we want is the outcome is that the kids are eating healthier foods.
Yeah.
So.
But that's, I mean, it's so, I think it's so hard to move those measures, especially from an intervention like this. You know, it's one basket, you know, 60% of people get the basket. It only has, you know, it's one snack a day maybe. So, I mean, of course, that's what we're all aiming for, and that's why we put those measures in there. But to me, that would be sort of miraculous if we could move that measure from this kind of intervention. Maybe if we did it